Think of a wilderness. It begins in the east with a barrier of mountains and then stretches westward for some 400 miles, reaching all the way to the Mississippi River. The wilderness is green and fertile. Game abounds, deer and buffalo roam. A great and proud nation of Indians, the Cherokee, lives in the eastern wilderness. They farm and they hunt and they have their own civilization which, to the white men, seems uncivilized. For the white men find the wilderness. In a natural progression, first come explorers, Spanish, French, and British, then soldiers, then hunters and traders. They are visitors whose eyes note and whose minds record the beauty and abundance of the wilderness. And finally, last in the progression, the settlers. They have come to stay. This is the story of Tennessee during the American Revolution. As the decade of the Revolution began, Tennessee was a wilderness. But drawn by the fertility and beauty of the land, people were beginning to move into the wilderness. Because they chose to live over the mountain on the western side of the Appalachians, they were called the Overmountain People. The theme of this story is the wilderness and the struggle of the Overmountain People to tame it and claim it. Settlement began in 1769. Traveling on buffalo paths and Indian trails, the settlers came down the valleys from Virginia and across the mountains from North Carolina. The 1760s had been troubled years. As the American colonies matured, they wanted greater control over their own affairs. But the colonies were a part of the vast British Empire, and the British believed the only economical way to manage this far-flung empire was by stricter supervision. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was certainly aimed at managing and containing the colonies. In it, Britain forbade settlement west of the Appalachians. The intent was to pacify the Indians, reduce the danger of war with them, and avoid the expense of maintaining troops to patrol the long, exposed border. And yet, in spite of the proclamation, the settlers came. The growing population of the eastern colonies caused many to look for deliverance to the rich westward lands. There a man could have for himself and his family 300, 400, 500 acres or more, and the land was beautiful. One settler, trying to describe his emotions when he first arrived, could only say, "We saw mountains upon mountains upon mountains." While Jefferson, Franklin, John Adams, and others talked and wrote about the rights of the colonies, the role of government, liberty, and independence, the people who lived over the mountains were, in a sense, already independent. They had to be. They had to provide everything for themselves, from food and shelter to law and order. They settled in the upper northeast corner of the Valley of the Holston. There were 4 settlements. James Robertson brought his family here from North Carolina. John Sevier, who was to be the hero of Kings Mountain and the first governor of Tennessee, was another Wataugan. Jacob Brown founded this settlement. It was named for John Carter, who, like Jacob Brown, ran a country store. This settlement was closest to Virginia. Evan Shelby and his family lived here, and Shelby had a store popular with the hunters, including Daniel Boone. The settlements would have been illegal except for the action of the British agents for Indian Affairs. Recognizing the determination of the new arrivals to stay in their valleys, the British agents on several occasions treated with the Cherokee for more land. As these cessions were made, the boundary lines set by the proclamation of 1763 gradually altered. After one such revision, the settlers believed they were in Virginia territory. But when the new boundary was drawn, only the north of the Holston settlement was under Virginia's protection. The other settlements, although technically within the chartered limits of North Carolina, were, in fact, isolated in Indian territory with no government to turn to. And so, in 1772, they formed their own government, the Watauga Association. It was born out of necessity, as the Overmountain people saw the need to protect themselves with the law as well as with their rifles. The Watauga Association was a means of transacting legal affairs and of dealing with criminals who tried to escape justice by fleeing west of the Appalachians. It was a homespun government that was also a democratic one, governing with the consent of the governed. Because of trouble with the Indians, the Watauga Association also sponsored a company of riflemen under James Robertson. One settler, in a masterpiece of understatement, reflected on his fellow frontiersmen. They, in a general way, appeared cheerful and happy when they were not being disturbed by the Indians. Unfortunately, they were disturbed fairly often. Remembering an Indian raid, this settler said, "As soon as day made its appearance, a number of men went well armed to the home of John Roberts, and to their extreme sorrow found him, his wife, and children killed and scalped. The day after Roberts and his family was buried, all the neighbors went to building forts." By 1774, the settlers had built a system of forts, and whenever word came that the Indians were near, families took refuge in the nearest stronghold. Here they might remain for weeks at a time, leaving their homes and farms untended. The settlers were able to make arrangements to lease their land from the Cherokee, but still the raids continued. Abrupt departures from home and prolonged stays in the forts were part of frontier life. Meanwhile, the seaboard colonies were having serious problems. The year 1773 culminated with the Boston Tea Party, an act designed as direct defiance of British authority. Early in 1774, England responded with a series of measures which stripped the Massachusetts Bay Colony of its rights and placed it under direct British rule. King George said, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." The problem had become a crisis, and in September 1774, the colonies formed a united front by meeting in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. On the Western Front, the autumn of '74 found a group of Overmountain men fighting the Indians at Point Pleasant in the area now known as West Virginia. The Indians were defeated, and the way was left open for further expansion westward. One of the land speculators who had his eye on this newly won territory was Colonel Richard Henderson of North Carolina. He formed the Transylvania Company and negotiated with the Cherokee to buy 20 million acres. The fertile plains that are today Middle Tennessee and Kentucky. In payment, the Cherokee were to receive merchandise worth 10,000 English pounds. This great land deal was transacted in March 1775 at the Sycamore Shoals of the Watauga River. The Watauguans were host to more than 1,000 Indians who began to arrive as early as January. The Cherokee had a fondness for treaty meetings and negotiations. There was ceremony and festivity, and the chiefs took the opportunity to demonstrate their oratorical powers and their skill at diplomacy. The Cherokee had two leaders, both elderly. Oconostota was big, strong, and outspoken. Attakullakulla was thin and frail with keen intellect. He was nicknamed the Little Carpenter because it was said he could join the parts of a treaty as deftly as a carpenter joined wood. Within the limits of his loyalty to his people, he was a friend to the white man. The Little Carpenter's son, Dragging Canoe, was not a friend. As he saw more and more land pass from red man to white man, he feared for the future of his people. He was totally opposed to the transaction at Sycamore Shoals. Leaping up, he made a fiery speech in which he asked his brothers how their children would live when there were no more hunting grounds. Then turning to the white man, he prophesied, "You have bought a fair land, but there is a cloud hanging over it. You will find its settlement dark and bloody." Then, as a further protest, he left the proceedings. The meeting continued, and while the Indians were still in a sulling mood, the settlers were able to make their own deals to buy their land from the Cherokee. The meeting ended satisfactorily for those still present. Colonel Henderson had his 20 million acres, so he thought. The settlers had secured their land, so they thought. And the Indians had enough merchandise to stock a half a dozen frontier stores. The next month, April, brought alarming news from the colonies. There had been fighting at Lexington and Concord. Then a succession of events. The Second Continental Congress in May, the Battle of Bunker Hill in June, and George Washington's assumption of command over the Continental Army in July. Without hesitation, the Overmountain people cast their lot with the colonies. They were lovers of liberty who were willing to work and fight in order to be free to make their own futures. Circumstances had made them an independent people. They believed in self-rule. It had already worked for them with the Watauga Association. And there was a practical consideration. They wanted clear title to their land, which was part of a tract owned by an Englishman, Lord Granville. Independence from Britain would also remove the hated proclamation line of 1763. In June 1776, a small group of Overmountain men fought for the first time in the Revolution. At Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, they were part of the American force which turned back 10 British ships seeking to capture Charleston, and in the process, fired a shot which struck the British admiral in the seat of his pants. More of the Overmountain men would have participated, but there was Indian trouble at home. The British had supplied the Cherokee with guns and ammunition, a goodwill gesture to cement Anglo-Indian relationships so that if the need arose, the Indians would be willing to fight alongside the British. With this stockpile of weapons, the Cherokee were ready to reclaim their lands. Although the older leaders were willing to share their land with the white men, the young warriors led by Dragging Canoe were not. They were determined to save their nation by driving the white man from the land. The British agents sent a warning to the settlers. They must move. The Cherokee would never acknowledge their claim to the land. But the Overmountain people would not move. Early in June, a message arrived from Nancy Ward, a Cherokee woman. Nancy Ward was what the Cherokee called a beloved woman. She was revered by the Cherokee nation and had the power to speak in the councils of the chiefs. She was a friend of the white men. It was her desire that all people living in this land of valleys, mountains, and rivers should live in peace and harmony. Fearing for the lives of the settlers, she sent word that the warriors were planning to attack. And so, in the momentous month of July 1776, the month in which the Declaration of Independence was signed, the Overmountain people were preparing to fight for their homes and their lives. The Indians attacked in mid-July. The Carter's Valley settlement was unprotected. The settlers were forced to flee. North of the Holston, 3 companies of riflemen met a large force led by Dragging Canoe. And so began the Battle of Island Flats, an hour of combat fought mostly hand-to-hand. The Indians were overconfident and discarded their usual tactics in favor of a headlong rush into the enemy ranks. It ended in defeat for the Indians, who fled, carrying with them their wounded leader, Dragging Canoe. At daybreak the next day, warriors attacked Fort Watauga, surprising a group of women who'd left the fort to milk the cows. One young woman, Catherine Sherrill, found her path blocked by Indians and raced to the stockade wall determined to climb it. Tradition has it that it was the strong hand of John Sevier that caught hers and pulled her to safety. 4 years later, after the death of his first wife, John Sevier married Catherine Sherrill. The siege lasted 2 weeks. When a group of braves tried to set fire to the walls, Anne Robertson, enterprising sister of James, organized a brigade of women to pour boiling water on the Indians below. The scalded warriors had to abandon their project and flee to safety. The Cherokee lifted the siege when they learned of dragging canoes' defeat at Island Flats, and that a relief force was on its way to rescue the beleaguered settlers. During the remaining weeks of the summer of '76, while General Howe was trying to take New York and General Washington was trying to keep it, the Overmountain men, along with a group of Virginia militiamen, built Fort Patrick Henry at the Long Island of the Holston. The largest fort on the frontier, its formidable presence deterred the Indians from launching major attacks. In the fall, an army of 1,800 assembled at the fort, and under the command of Colonel William Christian, set out to march deep into the wilderness to the Cherokee towns. By breaking the strength of the Indians, the settlers hoped to weaken the British as well. The appearance of so large an army overwhelmed the Indians. They dispersed, abandoning their towns and sued for peace. Only Dragging Canoe held out. With a band of warriors, he moved south to settle at Chickamauga and form his own tribe. The treaty meeting was held the following July. As usual, the Indians began to arrive well before the appointed time. In March, they began appearing at the sacred Indian treaty ground, the Long Island of the Holston. Here they camped for several months. And on July 4th, 1777, the Cherokee and the Overmountain People, who exactly a year before had been enemies, joined together to celebrate the first anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. At the end of July, the treaty was signed. In it, the Cherokee relinquished all land already occupied by the whites, but retained the Long Island of the Holston, their sacred treaty ground. So there was peace with the Indians, and all was quiet on the frontier for the next 2 years, except for the raids which Dragging Canoe and his band made from Georgia to Pennsylvania. In 1779, Colonel Evan Shelby launched an amphibious expedition against Dragging Canoe. In canoes and pirogues, several hundred frontiersmen went downriver, surprised the Chickamauгans, and burned their towns. The Indians scattered, and for the time being, their raids ceased. The Revolutionary War was now 5 years old. After that worst of seasons, the winter of Valley Forge, there'd been encouraging news. The Americans had defeated Burgoyne at Saratoga, and France, a great power, had entered the war as America's ally. But 1780 brought bad tidings. The British captured Charleston. Lord Cornwallis's army, under Colonel Tarleton and Colonel Ferguson, marched with impunity across the Carolinas. Several times, the Overmountain men crossed the mountains and helped defeat Ferguson's troops. Then came the crushing defeat of the Americans at Camden, South Carolina. Cornwallis appeared close to subduing the entire South. But the frontiersmen, who had been plaguing the British all summer, presented a threat to the British position in the Carolinas. In an effort to clear his left flank, Cornwallis sent Colonel Ferguson to the frontier. Ferguson dispatched a message to the settlers. They were to declare for the crown, or he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. In response to this threat, Colonel Isaac Shelby and Colonel John Sevier made immediate plans to raise an army and attack Ferguson before he could attack the settlements.
But now I am a soldier, my captain's gone before.
On September 25th, 1780, the troops mustered at Sycamore Shoals. Nearly all the able-bodied men had enrolled, including many boys in their teens. Each had a horse, a rifle, and a bag of parched corn. These Overmountain men were not trained soldiers, but they were expert horsemen and expert marksmen. And they had adopted the Indian methods of warfare. The Army received the blessing of the Reverend Samuel Doak, and then, echoing the last words of his prayer, "Help us as good soldiers to wield the sword of the Lord and Gideon," they set out across the mountains. On the east side of the mountains, they were joined by companies from the Carolinas and Georgia. Colonel Ferguson was found at Kings Mountain in the northeast corner of South Carolina. On the summit of a 60-foot ridge, he and about 1,000 Tories awaited reinforcements from Cornwallis. "Here we are," boasted Ferguson, "kings of Kings Mountain. Only the Almighty," he declared, "could take it from him." On October 7th, 1780, the Americans reached Kings Mountain and dismounted at the base of the slope. Using trees as cover, they advanced up the slope, closing the circle on Ferguson. "Here they are, boys. Shoot like hell and fight like the devil," shouted Colonel Shelby, and the battle began. When Ferguson's troops charged with bayonets, the Americans, using a technique borrowed from the Indians, receded behind the trees to reload and then return. 3 times the Americans were repulsed by bayonet charges. On their 4th try, they reached the summit. Like a man possessed, Ferguson was everywhere, sounding his silver whistle for help when he found weak spots in his lines and using his sword to slash down the white handkerchiefs hoisted on branches by some of his men. Sevier threw his men against the British center, countercharged and held until Shelby and Campbell reached him. 2 horses were shot out from under Colonel Ferguson. Then he was brought down. Not the Almighty, but a Western frontiersman had deposed the king of Kings Mountain. Ferguson's deputy sent out a rider with a white flag, and an American command ended the battle. "Officers, go to your cells. Prisoners, take off your hats and sit down." Spontaneously, the Americans gave 3 long cheers. The Battle of Kings Mountain was the victory of the frontiersmen coming from behind every tree on the mountainside. Colonel Ferguson's defeat at Kings Mountain and Colonel Tarleton's defeat at Cowpens forced Cornwallis to postpone his planned invasion of North Carolina. When he did try again, the American position was stronger. He had to withdraw to the Virginia coast for fresh supplies and reinforcements, and in October 1781, he surrendered at Yorktown. The victory at Kings Mountain was a crucial link in this chain of events. Thomas Jefferson described it as the joyful annunciation of that turn in the tide of success which terminated the Revolutionary War with the seal of independence. The struggle of the Overmountain people to tame and claim a corner of the wilderness that lay west of the Appalachians began with treaties and boundaries, leases and land purchases. It became a war fought on the home front, and then, as the British threatened the South, changed in scope and intent. At Kings Mountain, the domestic struggle of the Overmountain people to possess the land met and joined the larger struggle for liberty, and the two became one cause. 1783, the year the peace treaty was signed with the British, marked an ending and a beginning. Now the new nation could put into practice the principles the patriots had fought for. The settlements on the western frontier had become a part of the sovereign states of Virginia and North Carolina. The Overmountain people were in their valleys to stay, and the way west was open. Daniel Boone had blazed a trail across the Cumberland Mountains, the wilderness road. And people, much like the Overmountain people, strong, self-sufficient, practical, and ambitious, were following the road into the wilderness. They were prepared to start at the beginning, to work hard and to fight, if necessary, to win their share of the land. For these people, always, the promise of the wilderness outweighed its peril.